Again, I thank everyone for being here today. A little bit about our organization, American Farmland Trust. Who worked with Becca and Allie to put together this study and this webinar. We are a national organization that works to save the land that sustains us. And we do this through our three-pillar mission to protect farmland, promote sound farming practices, and keep farmers on the land to support farm viability. A lot of folks recognize us by our No Farms, No Food bumper sticker. And we have several national initiatives, including our Farms for New Generation, our soil health and climate teams, and we also have 8 regional teams. L'Oreal and I are on our Midwest regional team, where we work as boots on the ground to address this 3-pillar of our mission in the 8 Midwestern states that we work. So why are we here talking today? I first wanted to provide a little bit of context, what we've seen historically or since 2001 in the United States as it relates to agricultural land, and then what we are anticipating to see moving forward. As part of our Farms Under Threat initiative, American Farmland Trust, we conducted research and identified that between 2001 and 2016, the United States of America, oops, did I do that? Okay. The United States of America converted 11 million acres of agricultural land, which is equivalent to 2,000 acres a day over the time span of those 15 years. We know that 4.4 million acres of that total conversion happened on the nation's most productive, versatile, and resilient soils. So that means that 4.4 million acres of our best agricultural land in the nation were converted to uses that are not compatible with agriculture. Go to the next slide. I like to show this map because it really is indicative of where the nation's best farmland is located. As you can see, we are very blessed here in the Midwest. We have the most, like I said, productive, versatile, and resilient land in the country for growing our food, fiber, and fuel. And some would argue some of the best farmland in the world. Unfortunately, though, as we saw on the last slide, our farmland is being converted to non-agricultural uses at an alarming rate, and this is something that AFT strives to address through promoting our farmland protection work. Specifically here in Wisconsin, between 2001 and 2016, nearly 250,000 acres were lost in that time span of 15 years. And again, 62% of that conversion happened on some of our best soils that we have here in the state. Looking at the data a different way. As you see here, this is kind of presenting in a graph form. You'll see over time, the acreage and number of farms have decreased between 2002 and 2022. So another set of data that really captures the fact that we are converting our farmland to non-agricultural uses in the state. So looking ahead, through our Farms Under Threat research, we took historic or past trends of development and conversion of farmland and modeled that forward to identify what we can expect to see between 2016 and 2040. Through this work, we have identified that Wisconsin's going to lose at least 515,000 acres of farmland, which, as you can see here, is equivalent to 2,400 farms, 6,400 farm jobs, and 377 million in farm output. These, probably unsurprisingly to the folks on this call that are located in Wisconsin, but the hardest hit counties that we envision are going to be impacted by this conversion are Dane, where Madison is located, Waukesha, which is located between Milwaukee and Madison along the I-94 corridor, and St. Croix over near the cities. So I wanted to provide kind of the national context. We talked a little bit about the most versatile, resilient, and productive agricultural lands. And we know how most of that is located here in the Midwest. So this is a graph of the top 12 states of acres of nationally significant land, so that best soil that we have in the country, and the rate of conversion. As you can see, Wisconsin is 7th on this list, which is not something that we want to see, but Wisconsin is predicted to be one of the top states in the nation that's going to lose some of the most productive soils that we have in our country to grow our food. So what are we going to do about this, and how can we address the loss of farmland? There are programs and tools that exist. Um, one of which is the agricultural conservation easement, which is a permanent protection on your land. However, as you see here into the graph on the right, these state level programs that exist to fund agricultural conservation easements, also called PACE programs, they are largely do not exist or not incredibly active in the Midwest. So if you think about the map that we saw earlier that showed the most productive and versatile soils, you'll see that those state programs and the map of our best soils do not quite overlap. That means that we need to do more, and we should be doing more to invest in and protect our farmland into the future. So that's the context of the map on the left. Those are state-based programs that invest in farmland protection, or on the right. And then on the left, these are the dollars that from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. They also have a farmland protection program, which is called the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. And every year, each state gets an allocation or amount of funding that's kind of granted to the state to conduct these permanent farmland protection. Here in Wisconsin, you'll see between 2016 and 2023, we're really hovering around $400,000 annually. While this is a helpful investment in our state in farmland protection, $400,000, considering the cost of land prices, really is enough to do 1 to 2 easements annually, which is not enough funding in the toolbox to help address some of the farmland that we are going to continue to lose. So knowing this, American Farmland Trust, in partnership with 18 other organizations, came together to form the Wisconsin Farmland Protection Partnership. We're really a group of organizations across the state. This includes Land Trust, UW Wisconsin Extension and Department of Agronomy, also Department of Agriculture here in the state, and many research entities like Savannah Institute and Michael Fields, and some municipal partners that have farmland protection programs at the local level, so at the town or county level. If you go to the next slide, the goals of this Wisconsin Farmland Protection Partnership were to dramatically increase the number of acres that we're able to permanently protect in the state through agricultural conservation easements. So this partnership is partly funded through USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. We are awarded $7 million from Natural Resource Conservation Service to permanently protect farmland through agricultural conservation easements, so purchasing the development rights of that land and compensating the landowners for that work, and then 2, to advance the adoption of soil health practices on protected land. We really at AFT believe that we don't want to just protect land and move on to the next site. We want to ensure that that protected land is not only prevented from being developed into the future, but is also being managed to the best of our ability to ensure that the soils can continue to function and grow our food and our fiber. We go to the next slide. So I've been talking a lot about conservation easements, so I think it would be helpful for this group that maybe some of you that may be unfamiliar to understand what that means. So conservation easements, at the high level, they're a deed restriction. They are a voluntary legal agreement between a landowner and an entity, which can be like a land trust, like Brownsville Conservancy or Tall Pines Conservancy, even American Farmland Trust is a land trust, or it can be a local government entity like Rock County, for example, or Town of Dunn, for example. So it's a real estate transaction between a landowner and the entity, in which the entity negotiates the terms of an easement and permanently restricts the property for the accomplishment of protecting certain conservation values. A conservation easement, high level, sometimes more broadly can focus on like natural habitat protection or riparian corridors. Think about prairies or high quality hardwoods. But in the context of this call and this partnership, we're talking about agricultural conservation easements. So agricultural conservation easements are just a type of a conservation easement. You can go to the next slide, please. Which really helps to permanently restrict development on a land, or on a farm. And what I mean by that is we're not allowing the farm to be subdivided into housing development lots. We're not building gas stations or Walmarts or Amazon warehouses we're really preserving the land in perpetuity, so forever, for the purposes of agricultural production. This is important to point out because it's slightly different than a conservation easement, which maybe you'll have different conservation values, whether it be, like I said, high quality prairie or hardwood forest. An agricultural conservation easement protects land in perpetuity for the purpose of farming. And really what this does is allows us to ensure that the farm can be viable into the future, and by allowing the development of certain on-farm infrastructure, whether that be a barn or processing or hoop houses and all these things that you see here on the chart. So, but then on the prohibited side, again, we don't allow that commercial and industrial development. Our easements typically don't allow the property to be subdivided. So we're really working to permanently protect the purposes of the land for agricultural production. So we have a lot of flexibility in agricultural conservation easements to ensure that 100 years from now, when agriculture may look very different than what it looks like now, that farm is still viable and it's still protected from, housing and commercial industrial type development. Keep moving. Thank you. And so the why. There's many, as I mentioned before, agricultural conservation easements are voluntary, and in some situations, farmers and landowners are compensated for this real estate transaction where they permanently restrict their land for the purpose of agriculture. And some may wonder why would I do that as a farmer or as a landowner? There are many reasons. One being farmer legacy. Many farmers would like to see their land stay in farming as part of their legacy, and agricultural conservation easements really allow farmers to ensure the land is stewarded, that the land that was stewarded by past generations will stay in farming long after they are no longer farming. Fostering the next generation of farmers is another benefit to farmland protection, and in particular agricultural conservation easements. So we know that escalating land values and, again, competition for land from developers and non-farming investors really puts land ownership out of reach for many producers that want to enter the field of agriculture. This includes both those with established operations seeking to expand, and even more so undercapitalized farmers that are just trying to get their foot in the door. So agricultural conservation easements can, if done right, assist with the farmland transfer and create an affordability for the next generation by transferring the land at agricultural value. We also know that nearly 60% of U.S. farm market value is produced near cities. So that includes 90% of fruits, nuts, berries, 81% of vegetables, 2/3 of our dairy, and nearly over half of eggs and poultry are produced around our cities. Why this matters in the context of farmland protection is these farms in these metro-influenced areas are the farms that are most threatened by conversion to development. So agricultural conservation easements is a tool in our toolbox that allows us to protect the land base surrounding these metro areas and ensure that we have local foods in our communities into the future. Environmental concerns, it's probably not a surprise to you folks, but undeveloped open space, including agriculture, can provide vital resources such as habitat, recreation, flood control, water quality, health, and climate resilience benefits, especially when those farms are managed in a way that's regenerative and takes care of the soils on the farm. So the permanent conversion of farmland to development doesn't just impact agriculture, but also impacts our rural view sheds and natural habitat. It creates some landscape fragmentation in some cases. It can contribute to degraded water quality and, again, the permanent loss of these open space. And in a moment, the last bullet here, in a moment, we are going to dig deeper into the benefits of farmland protection to local and state economies. Our colleagues, Allie and Becca, are going to dive into what this means and what farmland protection, investing in farmland protection, the benefits that it can provide to our local and state economies. Next slide. So now we are this is the world premiere of a farmland protection profile that we conducted in partnership with Amana's family located here in Wisconsin, who are permanently protecting their farm in partnership by working with Tall Pines Conservancy as part of our Wisconsin Farmland Protection Partnership. So I hope you all enjoy.
The Wisconsin landscape is changing. Our state will lose over 500,000 acres of farmland by 2040, placing the livelihoods of thousands of farm families at risk. But the Modest family farm will be there forever. To protect their land and legacy, the Modest family is placing their land in an agricultural conservation easement with Tall Pines Conservancy, with support from the Wisconsin Farmland Protection Partnership. The easement will preserve their family's story and secure their descendants' futures while saving the land that sustains us.
I'm George Modest, and this is my wife Elaine.
We were married 59 years ago. We started planting trees pretty soon after that.
And we're sitting out back of our house in our park. We live in a town of Ashland. If the camera were to turn around and pan, you would see about 10,000 pine trees. The farm has been in the family for over 175 years. My great-grandfather purchased 91 acres in 1867, and it's been in our family ever since and passed down from generation to generation.
So my name is Carl Manis. I'm the youngest son of George and Elaine. To stay here has always been home to me. My kids love to come to the farm.
Not everybody gets to live in a place like that. We jokingly call it God's country, but we're blessed.
100 years from now, what will be happening to this land? Will it still be farm? Will it become agritourism of some sort, where they've got trees all over the place, people come camping? We don't know what's going to happen.
Peter Manis, son of George and Elaine Manis. The reality is, over time, agriculture changes. Maybe it'll be an apple orchard, or maybe it'll be something else, but it won't be houses. No one wants to see it split up. We've known families, people in the neighborhood, that plans aren't made, and then obviously a lot of squabbling between siblings, and that's something they definitely want to prevent. Now, as I look at my kids, how can the rest of the family really continue to enjoy it? Someone pass this on to the future generations, and they had the forethought to think through it enough that they cared about you even if they didn't meet you yet.
The commitment to Tall Pines Conservation Easement is a big commitment. The money involved today can ensure that the farm can be a farm for as long as whoever owns it wants to continue owning it and not cashing in. Putting the land into the conservancy helps speak to the idea that when you're a steward, and this stewardship is going to get passed down to future generations for someone else to take and carry the torch to be a steward of the land, pass it on. If we can preserve it, that's what we're going to do.
Special thanks to the Modest family and Tall Pines Conservancy for your support in capturing the Modest family stories. And with that, we will now transfer over to hearing about the economic impact assessment from Dr. Becca Jablonski and Dr. Allie Bauman.
Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you today. I have to say I've really enjoyed the opportunity to work on this project, and excited to talk a little bit about it, and then make sure we have enough time to answer any questions and sort of make sure we can talk about the specific things that you're interested in. So the question that we set out to look at is, what happens if there's $30 million that's invested annually in ag conservation easements in the state of Wisconsin? And to do this, what we assumed is that the $30 million, that 15 would come from the state and that 15 would come from federal sources. And we also assumed that the local area, so where we wanted to understand where the economic impacts would occur, was the state of Wisconsin. To do this, we used an input-output model, which is a very, very common way to do this. Because basically what they allow us to do is to track the flow of transactions. And I'll explain a little bit more about this in 1 second here. The key thing to understand is that only things that happen within the state are going to count towards the local economic impact. So what we're really focused on here is understanding how those easement dollars are spent and what portion of that is spent in the state and on what. So to get into a little bit more of the details, I grabbed a picture of Knoll's Dairy Farm. I've never been there. It looks like a beautiful operation. I saw that they just won the Leopold Conservation Award, so looks like a great operation. let's imagine that Knowles Dairy Farm is going to get some portion of this money. So they get a portion of this money, and they're going to do something different on that farm operation as a result of the conservation money. So they may do things like they may purchase better feed for their animals, or they may purchase new animals. They may do something, make a renewable energy investment on the farm, or purchase things differently than they did previously, like a new tractor. And they're going to need inputs for that tractor. So first, the money that the Knowles Dairy Farm directly got is called the direct effect. And then the portion of that money that gets spent on items in the local economy, remember in this case, that's the state of Wisconsin, that's called the indirect effect. In addition, Knowles Dairy Farm, in order to do things differently on the farm or to make different investments, they're going to hire employees, probably more employees, and those employees in turn are going to buy more things to some extent in the state of Wisconsin. They're going to purchase groceries, they're going to purchase childcare, they're going to spend money on rent, or they're going to buy new homes. And all of that together is called the induced effect. And so when we're talking about actually calculating the total multiplier effect or the economic impact, what we're doing is we're calculating the direct plus the indirect plus the induced effects. And you're going to see when I talk about the methods that we use to do this, it's relatively straightforward to understand what that direct effect is. So the direct effect is, right, the money in this case that comes from the conservation easement to the Knowles Dairy Farm. What's more challenging to understand is exactly how that money is spent. And then in turn, not just what Knowles is spending money on, but then what their employees are spending money on, or what the tractor supply dealer is spending money on, right? And how much of that is actually spent within the state of Wisconsin. So what we did was we went and did a literature review first. So we wanted to understand, first of all, was there an agreed upon economic impact assessment methodology specific to conservation programs? So Allie and I have done a ton of economic impact assessment work, but we hadn't done an economic impact assessment for a conservation easement program prior to this. We also wanted to understand what we knew about who participates in these conservation programs and how they spend the funds, right? And we actually have information on that. And you can imagine that who gets this money is going to have a big impact on how those funds are spent. And I'll give some examples of that in a minute. But just as an example, if you're a newer operation, right? So say you're like a young or beginning farmer, you may be more willing to make a pretty significant investment in the operation because you're intending to be there over a long time horizon. As opposed to if you're older and you don't necessarily have a new generation coming in, but you have this conservation easement money, you may be more likely to put more money into a retirement account to pay off debts and things like that, right? And so it may have different impacts in terms of spending in the local economy, and those are very important to capture in this economic impact assessment. So within the literature on how folks do this economic impact assessment for conservation programs, most of the economic impact assessments are focused on how that farm, so I gave you the example of Knowles Dairy, is spending that conservation money when they get it. And so that's what we choose to do for this work. There also is a literature talking about environmental services that are likely to accrue from those preserved farms. And we can actually measure those, right? There's a whole group of environmental economists that do exactly this. But we don't do that. And so that's one of the limitations, is that there may be some of these other benefits that are not accounted for in the way that we chose to do the assessment. So going back to understanding, right, how, again, in Knowles, in my example, is going to spend that money, we relied primarily on some work that had been done in Colorado that was led by Andy Seidel and his team. One of the nice things that Andy was able to do was to actually go and conduct interviews and surveys with farmers and ranchers in Colorado who had received conservation payments to understand how they had spent those funds. And so they have very detailed information on not just what was spent, but the portion of it that was local. We also reviewed some other articles that do this, that maybe had information that was not a full expenditure of those funds, but a little bit more basic information, like information from Daniels about spending on additional land purchases or real estate, for example. So we compiled all of this. And then what we also did was to understand from this report that Daniels put out that's specific to Pennsylvania, this concept of leakage. So what this is saying is that though let's just go back to that Knowles example, Knowles may get $1 million through a conservation easement program, they're not going to spend necessarily all of it, and they're not going to spend all of it in the local economy. So to the extent there are things like savings or they're paying off debt, that is not likely to be respent then in the local economy. It's sort of leaked out of that local economy prior to the additional spending occur. And so what that does is it limits what the economic impact is or what the results are of those funds. And so we wanted to make sure we were thinking about what portion of that spending actually stays within the economy versus goes away. The other thing we saw in the literature was some recent work from Jen Dempsey at American Farmland Trust. And we found that the farmers that are getting these conservation easements are more likely to implement different conservation practices compared to what we see in the Census of Agriculture. And so what we decided to do within our assessment was to create a subset of producers more likely to get these funds that we call conservation-minded farms. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we do this in a minute. But what's important to know here is that we're basically changing our understanding of how these funds are spent with the assumption that it's these conservation-minded operations that are going to get these funds. So what did we do? We estimated the impact. First, we did a $15 million and then a $30 million investment in agricultural conservation easements in the state of Wisconsin as part of Wisconsin's PACE program. And as I mentioned previously, we assumed 15 million would come from Wisconsin and 15 million from federal funds if there's that $30 million investment. We followed the economic impact assessment methods provided by Andy Seidel and his team, including the information on how those conservation easement funds are spent. And this is an important thing to keep in mind because it's one of the limitations of what we did is that sort of in best practice, we would have gone out and done a survey of Wisconsin farmers to understand how they might actually spend these funds and if it looks different than the population that Andy talked to. But we didn't have the time or resources to do that. And based on our conversations with the Wisconsin advisory team we worked with, it sounds like what Andy found was likely to be similar in the state of Wisconsin. So we used that. We started with then 2022 data from IMPLAN. IMPLAN provides data and software to conduct economic impact analyses. So if you go and look at economic impact assessments, they're generally done with IMPLAN. We use the IMPLAN data as a starting point. It assembles data from lots of different federal sources. We do not use their software to do the analysis. We do all of the analysis ourselves within Excel. All the modeling work. And we do this because it allows us to do a more fine level analysis and to actually make some modifications to some of the assumptions within the IMPLAN data. So to do that, we use the Census of Agriculture data to create a conservation-minded farm sector, which I'll show you a little bit more about in a second here. So once we had the IMPLAN data, the first thing we did was to look at the commodities of interest. So kind of who is going to get the money? Because you can imagine that a dairy farmer is going to spend money very differently, right, than a fruit and vegetable farmer in the state of Wisconsin, right? There's different kinds of inputs they need. Those inputs may be available differently in different places and in different quantities in the local economy. And so we want to make sure we're accounting for that. So we use the Census of Agriculture data to understand the proportion of sales across what we classified as 4 different commodities that we looked at. So you can see how we did this here. So our focus becomes on crop farming, not including fruits and vegetables, fruit and vegetable farming, livestock, and then dairy. This conservation-minded sector that we ended up developing as part of the findings of this Jen Dempsey paper and report, we used a number of different questions that are in both the 2017 and 2022 Census of Agriculture. So these are things like, do you practice rotational or management-intensive grazing? Do you practice alley cropping, silvopasture, or forest farming, right? And you can look at these. So essentially, if a farmer checked yes to any one of these questions, we classified them as conservation-minded. Conservation-minded farms make up the majority of farms in Wisconsin, but we do look at them separately across those 4 commodities, right, to really understand how what they purchase is different. So here you can see, this is from the Census of Agriculture data, how these conservation-minded operations across those 4 commodities purchase products. This is not saying the proportion that they purchase from Wisconsin. It's just the portion of what they purchase overall, right? So these are their expenditures. And so then we use this to understand then the portion of those expenditures that are local and again are going to have they're going to contribute to that local economic impact. So the next thing we do is we have this shock that goes into the state of Wisconsin. And in this case, the shock is that $30 million that comes from those conservation easement programs. And that $30 million is allocated based on how we think those different commodity producers are going to spend money in the local economy. And again, this is based on that survey work that Andy Seidel did in Colorado. And so you can see it things like reinvested in agricultural production. They purchased non-business goods. They donated money to charity. They put money into a savings account or paid down debt. And remember, this is an area that's more likely to leak out of the economy, right? Because it doesn't contribute to additional business purchases. They spent money on family education, like sending a student to college, or they invested in non-agricultural enterprises, right? Things like agritourism, hunting, fishing, and outdoor recreation. So once we did this in the model, we're able to get our results. And we're getting our results, remember, based on that direct effect. So this is the amount of money that's going from the conservation easement program. You'll notice that it's a little under $30 million, and that's because of some of that preliminary leakage that I mentioned that leaves the economy. So there's 27.5 million of that initial 30 million. That's the direct impact. The induced and indirect impact, right? That's the money then that's respent by those businesses and by labor in the local economy. And we can add those up to get the total impact. So what we're estimating is that the total impact resulting from that $30 million investment is 55.7 million, which gives us a total SAM multiplier. SAM stands for social accounting matrix multiplier, but it's the total multiplier effect of 2.02, right? So this means that for every dollar that's invested, there's going to be an additional $1.02 that's recirculated in the local economy. And you can also see things here like the labor income and employment effects and labor income per job. So in summary, right, what we can see from these results, we did a back of the envelope calculation, and we see that there's the potential to directly impact 13,000 acres of farmland and 55 farms, right, from that $30 million investment. I mentioned about the 55.7 million total economic impact and over 300 jobs. And there's also some other impacts that we didn't actually quantify, but we think are important to keep in mind. Right, the potential for environmental benefits if these conservation-minded operations are who actually receive the PACE program funds, as is found in Jen Dempsey's survey. And then also to support the next generation of farmers. One of the things that Jen Dempsey's report also showed is not just the benefits of these conservation programs to the people who directly get the conservation programs, but also then it makes the land more affordable when the transfer occurs. And so it can help the next generation of farmers get into owning property. Of course, there's more we could do to really understand the extent to which that occurs and try to quantify it with a survey. But I think without that this is a pretty detailed and rigorous way to do this kind of assessment. And I did just want to say that there are some limitations to the work that we did that I've tried to highlight throughout this short presentation. One is just that there's some general assumptions that are built into input-output models that I'm happy to talk about more in the Q&A period or send you more information on, but I'm not going to go into all those details here. We relied on the assumptions of previous research, right, especially from Andy Seidel's work. And there are maybe reasons why Wisconsin farmers or the recipients of those conservation dollars would spend them differently in the local economy. And then the analysis assumes the state is allocating all new funds to the PACE program. And this may not be the case, right? We know that there's limited resources, so it may mean that they're spending less money on other kinds of programs, and we don't actually sort of account for that loss in spending elsewhere as a result of additional spending to the PACE program. And that's something you might want to think about. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Florial.
I think that it comes back to me.
Oh.
So no worries. Thank you, Becca, for summarizing the research that you conducted as part of our Wisconsin Farmland Protection Partnership. And so the reason why I hope that it kind of was summarized in the last 40 minutes or so, but the reason why we wanted to do this assessment is we really wanted to see like what are the on-the-ground impacts of reinvesting in our state PACE program or Purchase of Agricultural Conservation Easement program. So I've included this map that we looked at before, again, just to again reiterate that, you know, even though we have some of the best soils in the nation here in the Midwest, we're not doing enough to protect those farms and that soil. So you'll see that Wisconsin is shaded in here on the map. And the reason for that is in 2009, as part of the Working Lands Initiative, we did get a formal PACE program or Purchase of Agricultural Conservation Easement program into the statute at the state level. Unfortunately, funding for that program from the state was rescinded in 2011, and it has not been funded since. So American Farmland Trust has been doing, along with many partners, some of whom are on this call today, have been doing work to kind of educate our decision makers, our community members, and our partners around the importance of investing in farmland protection, and in hopes that we can eventually see this program refunded in the future. So we started a Fund Our Farmland campaign. Kudos to L'Oreal for that fun description there. And in hopes to get this program refunded in our next state budget. Just for a little bit of background, this program is administered by our Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection, often referred to as DACCAP. And we believe that because of the significant funding that the USDA is investing in farmland protection through the Farm Bill, also through the Inflation Reduction Act, our hope is that at the state level, we can offer some funding to help leverage that federal funding and bring more funding to protect farmland into our state and into the pockets of our landowners and our farmers. And again, the data show, as Becca spoke to, that farmers and landowners that invest in agricultural conservation easements or participate in these programs are typically farmers that are more conservation minded and want to invest in conservation practices on farm. So with that, I think we're coming to our question portion of the call. Is that right, L'Oreal?
Yes, so we'll go ahead and start our Q&A session. Thank you, Angie, and thank you, Becca, for taking us on an overview of farmland protection in the state and what those dollars look like on the ground. So we'll go ahead and start out with some of our questions that were in the chat. Emmy Brawley asks, for the assumption regarding the use of easement proceeds, where does the purchase of additional agricultural land fit into?
So that's one of the categories, and I can pull it up again, that Andy's survey found that some of the operations do expand. And, you know, one of the things that I didn't spend a lot of time talking about, I just mentioned it briefly at the beginning, is that, you know, different types of operations, depending on who gets the funds, that they may spend those in different ways, right? So it may be that a younger operator may be more likely to expand the operation. And so therefore they are going to be the ones that purchase more land, right? And an older operation, especially that doesn't have a next generation coming in. So it varies, but that's absolutely in there.
And Samuel Cook asked a question about any mechanisms for purchasing land and having that land be conserved. Angie, I know you all are going to connect offline as well, but maybe you could speak to the buy, protect, sell model.
Sure. Thanks, L'Oreal. Yes, I think that's what I would like to talk with you about, Samuel. But it sounds like you're kind of thinking about the buy, protect, sell model, which Emmy Brawley's on the call, and she does a lot of that work through the Farms Fund with the Conservation Fund. And here at American Farmland Trust, we also do some buy, protect, sell projects. And what that is a farm is identified, and the entity or the land trust or the organization purchases that farm, then places an easement on that farm to permanently restrict those development rights, and again, conserve that farm in perpetuity for agricultural purposes. And then once that happens, the farm is then sold to the incoming farmer at a reduced value because as a result of the agricultural conservation easement. So we like to see, and we hope to see, when agricultural conservation easements restrict that development value on a farm, then that farm can be sold to an incoming farmer or landowner at that agricultural value, as opposed to the highest and best use value. And so that's a way that we're trying, that's a model that organizations are using across the country to help address the challenges in gaining access to land for various reasons, a lot of which is accessing capital or challenge in accessing capital. And of course, the increased land values that we continue to see across the Midwest and across the nation. So the buy, protect, sell model is one model that we can use to try and support farmers getting on land at a more affordable value.
And invite anyone else with questions to go ahead and unmute or drop them in the chat.
Hey, Florial, this is Rick Adamski, and I'm calling because I was wondering if there are any studies that have analyzed the implementation of the use value assessment in Wisconsin. It has helped reduce farm property taxes, but it has also provided a great tax shelter for wealthy investors and is very problematic in terms of inflationary pressure on those of us who own farmland or those beginning farmers who want to begin farming. So that's my question, if there have been any studies about that.
I am personally not aware of any studies. Becca or Allie or Angie, do you have any information on that?
I don't have any information, but the person I would suggest you get in touch with, who at least is, I think, the knower of all things in this space for Wisconsin, is Steve Deller. And I will put his email address in the chat box.
Thank you. And we have a few questions coming in on the chat. Can we talk about how the program fared during the 2009-2011 budget cycle? What was allocated at the state and federal level, and how were those dollars spent, and how many acres or farms benefited from that? And why has the program gone unfunded since 2011?
Yeah, a lot to talk about there. Thank you, Chad. So in 2009, when the Working Lands Initiative was put into statute here in Wisconsin, the PACE portion of the program, the Agricultural Conservation Easement portion of the program, was funded at $12 million. And then, as you know, during that time in Wisconsin, between 2009 and 2011, administrations changed. There were also some challenges in balancing the state budget, so that funding was rescinded. However, DATCAP, Department of Ag, had released essentially an ask for applications to the program, and already received applications and kind of went through working on the approval process. So the initial applications that were submitted to DATCAP through the program were ranked, and I think 12 to 17 were funded through the program. That funding was used through the Knowles-Nelson Stewardship Program because the initial funding was rescinded. It's a bit tricky, and it's a little you kind of have to dig to find out the specific details to what happened back in 2009, 2011. I'm happy to share a legislative report that talks about this and how the money flowed and where it was pulled from. And why did the program go unfunded after 2011? I think depending on who you talk to, that answer may be different. I do know that in 2011, again, the state budget, there was a lot of cuts because we had to manage a state budget. We're in a much better position today in 2024 going into the next budget cycle than we were in 2009. But in addition, again, there are administrative changes, and so depending on the priorities of both the governor and the legislator, some programs are less popular. And so, but the positive thing is agriculture and farmland protection is a bipartisan ideal, and folks on all sides of the aisle really do support, supporting our farmers, supporting land access, supporting farm transfer, local foods. These are all things that most people really care about. And we think that we're in a much better situation today going into budget cycle than we were then. And so again, the charge forward is reminding people that this statute exists. A lot of folks at the Capitol maybe weren't around back in 2009. So it's a matter of saying, hey, this exists on the books. Is it possible to maybe consider refunding it to address all of these challenges that we're facing in the agricultural community?
And Ben Kohlenberg asks, does the 2 times multiplier, the SAM multiplier, does that apply regardless of the amount of funding? Would that still be applicable for smaller amounts of funding? Or would that be an incorrect conclusion?
No, so that applies regardless of the amount of money. Well, let me say this a couple different ways. It applies regardless of the amount of money, assuming that you're trying to understand the economic impact of the state of Wisconsin. If you are, for example, a town or a county and you decide you're going to invest funds and you're interested in what the economic impact would be or the multiplier effect to a smaller region in the state, then it is likely that you're going to have a smaller economic impact, because if you think about it intuitively, there's less places to spend money in a smaller place compared to the state, right? The other caveat here is that, yes, it applies regardless of the amount of money, but at some point you're going to have invested enough money that you might have massive, more structural changes in the economy. And if that occurs, you would actually need to do another assessment. Does that make sense?
That makes sense to me. So another question from Samuel Cook is, what are some of the barriers or hurdles for farmers applying to these funds, and what are some of the ways or assistance for helping farmers access conservation funds?
Yeah, Samuel, I think you're talking about specifically agricultural conservation easement programs and funds. The barriers, the hurdles can be many things, but one thing that can be a challenge is when wanting to protect your land through an agricultural conservation easement, you have to find an entity, as we refer to it in the field, or a holder of the easement. So that would be, like I mentioned earlier, a land trust or a local government program. There has to be an entity that holds the easement, and their responsibility is to enforce the terms of the easement in perpetuity, so forever. And it's important that there's an entity available that has the capacity, both staff and funding, that can work with you as part of this real estate transaction and commit to ensuring the terms of the easement. So again, not splitting off the farm into housing lots or building a gas station. It's their role to enforce that in perpetuity. And so that requires an annual monitoring visit and working with the landowner, regardless of who is the landowner. The land can change hands. It's still in private ownership. The entity is responsible for working with that landowner to, again, ensure the terms of the easement are being met in perpetuity. So I guess in summary, one challenge can be finding that entity or land trust that is able to take on your farm as a project. Another one is more on something that comes up a lot is the need. A lot of these programs require matching funds, and not every landowner is able to donate the value of their land to serve as a match for these programs. So we talked about the federal program through U.S. Department of Agriculture. Typically, that program will provide 50% of the easement value and requires a 50% match. Some programs don't have cash to put that match up to, so then landowners are asked to do some type of donation for that match component. And so that can be a hurdle because again, like I said, not all landowners have the ability to donate some value of their land. And this is where state level programs and local level programs and federal level programs can all work together to kind of make the landowner more whole. So if we had a funded state program, which is what we're hoping to get to one day, we could provide that 50% match to the federal program and then the landowner doesn't have to do that donation. And then some other barriers are kind of some of the extra expenses related to real estate transactions, like appraisals, legal fees, the typical things that you would expect in a real estate transaction. As far as like working with an individual to go through the process, that's something that you would do as a landowner directly with that entity or land trust that you're working with. They really would go through that process with you to help you kind of talk through the easement language, and then work with, if you're going through the USDA program, working with Natural Resource Conservation Service to make sure everything moves smoothly. That's kind of like a partnership. And I do want to emphasize that depending on the program you go through, it can be a long process. So it's really a relationship that you're developing over time to accomplish your shared goals.
And Becca, I see that you've provided some insight into Sherry Janowski's question, which is how does easement dollars going towards paying down debt kind of impact the model? And I see that you've answered that in the chat, but was just wondering if you would mind speaking to that and maybe verbalizing that for us.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we also don't do in this study, but it's a really important question, is, you know, the impacts to producers themselves and to the next generation of producers. And so what we've looked at are what are the regional economic impacts, right, of this work. And that's obviously the entire economy is an important, let's just say that it's an important sort of stakeholder in this, but so are the individual producers. And so it just depends, as I gave the answer, right? It could be a good thing for producers to pay down debt. And what we see in general is that there's sort of bimodal usage of debt. There's good debt and bad debt. So debt is a really good thing if you're using it wisely and you're able to generate profits that exceed what you're paying essentially for that money. So anyway, I think when we're thinking about any sort of policy, we want to think about the different stakeholders and impacts that occur across those different places. And I can answer too. I saw there was one about the thoughts about the recent national election. So, and you know, I'm not from Wisconsin, but I can tell you that in Colorado, every 5 years, we've done a study with the Colorado Department of Agriculture to understand sort of public perception towards agriculture. And what we see across the board is that there are very high levels of interest in supporting agriculture, right? And thinking about and protecting land for farming. Where we see that there is divergence in opinion is how that should be done. And so, you know, I think that it's going to be an interesting discussion. I think that, you know, certainly that there's broad support of farmers, right, in the new administration, and broad support in this administration in thinking about opportunities to support agriculture. I would be surprised if it's through conservation easement programs, but there, I think, will be other kinds of opportunities. And especially just say one other thing, you know, given that it looks, or I haven't checked in a few hours, but that it looks like there's going to be a trifecta, right? And the House will also be majority Republican, right? And we don't have a new farm bill for 2 years late, right? That, I don't know, I think that there's probably two different things that could happen. You know, one is that we just can keep having these continuations and sort of wait and don't see a farm bill for a little bit. And the other option is that there's a farm bill that's really pretty dramatically reshaped in some ways, you know, given control of both the House and Senate by Republicans.
So I have a question about, so this would theoretically be a reinvestment of every 2 years with the PACE program. We would see the effects of this investment compound over time. Just hypothetically, maybe how would that shift? Is there kind of an upper limit of the impacts at the state economy?
Well, so this is sort of what I was trying to say before about these input-output models are static. So essentially what they're assuming is that there's a change based on this new injection, which in this case is a positive amount of money that's coming in and how it's spent. But at some point, there's enough money that there are these more fundamental changes that occur. And once that sort of happens, you really need to think about sort of a different modeling approach, right? Something that's more dynamic, because now you're not just going to see changes in what people are spending, but in broader changes in the structure of the economy. And so this, I don't know what the tipping point is in terms of a dollar amount. I would think about it, you know, Wisconsin. So at what point is there just a fundamental shift in sort of the landscape in some of these places? And it may occur, especially if you're thinking about it at a more local level than a statewide level. I can give you a quick example. A number of years ago, I did an economic impact assessment of the beer industry in New York State. And this is at a time when there was 10 acres of hops that were grown in the state and very few of these microbreweries. And in that case, right, we saw a small sort of investment, but you can see that because these were essentially like two new sectors that were being added into the economy, that very quickly you're going to see these broader structural changes that were going to occur that would require sort of a different type of assessment. Allie, do you want to add anything to that? I'm sorry, I just keep talking.
No, it's all good. And the one thing to know about economic impacts is they're kind of like a snapshot in time, not so much like projecting into the future and growth. It's kind of like if you gave money in 2022, this is what happened in 2022. Kind of one snapshot at a time.
Any other questions, thoughts, comments? Well, if anything does come to mind, we are available by email. And a big thank you to everyone attending today. As well, thank you to Becca and Allie for really shedding light on what investing in farmland protection looks like in the state economy. As I mentioned, this session and our slides will be available on American Farmland Trust Farmland Information Center. I will also follow up with those slides in an email as well. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time, and we appreciate your support in funding our farmland.
Thanks all.